In recent times, the Stamina Templar has probably had the most favourable balance of difficulty and rotation and damage potential, and this has allowed it to be one of the more popular classes stamina-wise in the Elder Scrolls Online. And honestly, not too much has changed in the last year, but here is some super old footage from around 3 years ago where I had really low FPS and back when it wasn't necessarily the best DPS to jab as much as possible. Hi, this is Liko and welcome to my Stamina Templar PVE Build and rotation video for the Flames of Ambition DLC. Today, we will take a look at a solid single target DPS build with a fairly traditional dual and bow setup. We will at the same time explore ways on how to tweak this build to take advantage of Vampirism, which as you can see has the ability to take your DPS to the next level. I will say at this point there is a pretty high risk reward balance here, so do beware. Thanks to Porky, or Haha Yes, for providing us with the Stamina Templar footage here. Before diving into the builds, let's get started with the choice of race, Mundus Stone and food. So for the choice of race, Orc used to be the flat out best for stamina DPS, but this is no longer the case. From now I will recommend either Khajiit or Dunmer as your very top choices. It's a toss up between the two, so honestly go with whichever you prefer out of those. However, having said, Orc really isn't too far behind. It still has some other very useful perks, so if you're currently an Orc, this doesn't mean you have to race change. So for the choice of Mundus Stone, in many cases for stamina DPS, I would recommend the Thief Mundus Stone for extra critical chance. If your crit chance is already pretty high before picking a Mundus Stone, like around 65 or 70%, then you could go with the Shadow Mundus Stone instead for extra critical damage. Now I can't put an exact number on it as it will depend on your exact build that you set up with, but if in doubt, I would go with Thief. Choice of food. Now this will most likely depend on your level of sustain and your HP threshold that you're comfortable running with. If you could do with a little more extra sustain and you don't feel like you need the extra HP, then lava, foot, soup and salt rice would be the way to go. If you're practicing on a target dummy, then I would also recommend selecting this food. If your sustain is decent but you need a little help with it and you need some HP as well, then I would recommend the Arteum takeaway broth, which gives the best mixture of everything useful. If you don't need any help with your sustain, then you can go with max HP, max stamina foods such as braised rabbit with spring vegetables. And this should give you the most DPS as long as you don't run out of resources. I should also mention just in case, but there is also a pure max stamina food, which gives a tiny bit more max stamina than all the previous, but nothing else. It also doesn't last as long, so for most people this is not worth it. An example of this is the hearty garlic corn chowder. Okay, cool, so let's take a look at the setups side by side then. On the left we have the non-vampire setup, and on the right we have the vampire setup. So for the non-vampire setup we have 5 pieces of deadly strikes with 2 daggers on the front bar. The 5-piece bonus increases damage done by physical, bleed, poison and disease damage of time abilities and channeled abilities by 20%, which is basically like almost all of our damage. On the body we have 2 crit chance pieces for the monster sets, in this case we're using Slimecraw and Grunwolf, and then on the body we also have 5 pieces of Relequen, which is great for single target damage providing you are able to keep up consistent light attacks. Suitable alternatives here are Sul-Xan and the new Kinra set. Yanders is also worth a shout as well, and advancing Yokeda can also work, particularly as the front bar set in this case. On the back bar we have the Maelstrom Bow, which is more or less the best choice out there I think, and for the vampire setup the main difference here is the use of the Ring of Pale Order, and that's a mythic item that was introduced recently in the Markov patch. Here you should then replace a monster set piece to complete 2 set pieces. In this case we have Grunwolf used, but actually you should use Slimecraw for the best DPS. Everything else is basically the same as the non-vampire setup. Taking a look at the skills, here we have the bars for a vampire shown, and we will discuss the minor tweaks for without Vampirism. These are also probably the simplest bars in history, so forgive me if it looks like I am being lazy here. First we have then Silver Leash. This is here for the Fighter's Guild passive, which is a few percentage points of weapon damage. We then have Barb Trap. Again, it's here for the Fighter's Guild passive, but you'll also want to cast this for decent dot damage and for the Minor Force buff, which gives 10% crit damage. Next we have Biting Jabs, which is basically the one skill that we need to care about, and it gives us so much. It's responsible for a huge proportion of our single target damage thanks partially to the Burning Light passive. It also gives 10% crit damage when slotted thanks to the Piercing Spear passive. Usage also gives minor protection for 6 seconds thanks to the Spear Wall passive. Bear in mind though that this is a channeled ability and can be rather difficult to time perfectly. If you try and light weave too fast, you'll most likely miss the light weave before the next cast if you cast it too slowly, and well, you'll be simply doing less damage from doing a slower rotation. Bar swapping off this ability is rather difficult too. As it stands, it's also quite difficult to get the full potential if your ping is around 200 or higher due to how this skill is implemented. Anyway, the way Burning Light works, you'll literally get the best results more or less casting this ability, aside from one or two which we'll discuss later. The next skill is a flex spot, and for a non-vampire you'd simply slot another Fighter's Guild skill as a passive. When you are a vampire, however, you'll want to slot Simmering Frenzy, which gives you loads and loads of spell and weapon damage over time at a health cost that ramps up every second and also prevents you from getting outside sources of healing whilst it turns on. Considering that in many cases you'll be using the Ring of Pale Order, this latter part doesn't necessarily matter. This skill can be cast off the global cooldown as well, which means you can pretty much cast it at the same time as any other normal skill. It can be a little funky though with channeled ability, so bear that in mind, and untoggling the ability may feel a little clunky as well, so try and get comfortable with this. Next we then have Camo Hunter and Flawless Dawnbreaker here as Fighter's Guild passives again, though Dawnbreaker can be useful if you won't be able to fully charge your backbar ultimate. A notable alternative skill to slot here is Power of the Light, which is great if you need a source of Minor Breach, although this comes more easily than it did in the past. Also good for Minor Sorcery as well, if that's needed. It does a little damage and stores a larger burst which hits 6 seconds later, though unfortunately it scales rather poorly when you consider all raid buffs, so we'd rather give it a miss for 12-person trials at this current stage. On the back bar, the Maelstrom Bow bar, it is more of the same. Again, we have a Silver Leech for the passives. You can slot a heal such as Vigor or any alternative utility skill really that might be needed in any given situation. We then have Ritual of Retribution. This is a magic costing ability which is really nice for your stamina sustain of course, and it's really good for AoE and single target damage and provides a nice synergy as well. You'll essentially want to cast this once every backbar rotation along with Endless Hail, which is a nice AoE ability which does pretty good damage thanks to the Maelstrom Bow. Also helps to proc our backbar enchant. The following two skills are also here only for the Fighter's Guild weapon passives, and again can be replaced for anything really, considering that we are not on this bar for long at all. Meteor then is our backbar ultimate ability, probably our best bet for single target DPS at this point, providing the enemy is able to sit in the AoE the whole time. It's not a massive AoE, so if you need something that's a bit better for moving targets, then you can consider something like Ballista, or use Flawless Dawnbreaker, which is the ultimate that we have slotted on the front bar. Moving on to the passes, I'll let both play out at the same time. As before, on the left we have the non-vampire setup with the vampire setup on the right. The rotation either way is rather simple on paper, but can be quite difficult to perfect despite that. We are using a 14-second rotation here, seeing as this is the length of Endless Hail, and this more or less defines how frequently we stop casting jabs and go to our backbar to cast Endless Hail and Ritual of Retribution, which we'll do whilst we're here. In general, this suits us as we want to avoid bar swapping off jabs, which as a channeled ability is hard to do without losing time. Otherwise, you should try to cast Trap once per rotation, or cast it dynamically whenever it's about to fall off. And for the rest of the time you'll be wanting to cast jabs, and for this you'll want to perfect the best timing for queuing up the next light attack weave, since it can be quite sensitive. In general, I would say it helps to avoid going by the animation itself and go purely by timing, which I would say is slightly longer than a weave of any instant cast ability. Also, pay attention to when we bar swap from the front bar to the back bar before the cast of Endless Hail, and this is how it works. After the last jabs, we want to light attack on the front bar, then only after we do this we bar swap and then cast Endless Hail. You don't have to be sort of immediately bar swapping here, you can have time to ensure that this happens smoothly. This is the only way that we can ensure that we bar swap from the front bar to the back bar without making any compromises. So if you're used to doing this with a dual bow setup, then this should be familiar to you. But if you're not, do pay attention to this, and yeah, play the video at 0.5 speed if it helps. Anyway, this rotation doesn't really change at any point during the encounter, so you won't necessarily need to do anything different in execute. As always, I will include a static rotation outlined in the description below. Let's catch up after both passes are finished. Okay, great. So looking at both passes then, it's immediately clear that biting jabs and burning light dominate both passes. Consider the fact that much of the damage from light attacks and Relequen, down as harmful winter, are also gained whilst casting jabs. It really becomes clear how reliant this class is on this one ability. Ritual of Retribution and Endless Hail do contribute quite nicely though, considering how infrequently they need to be cast. The same goes for Barb Trap. Static damage from burning and poison make up the rest of the damage, along with a few other little things. As you can see, we spend less than 10% of our time on the back bar, and when we do, it contributes to like 2% of our total damage, which is basically nothing. And yeah, this means the passive skills we have on the back bar can genuinely be whatever you like, without any real loss, which is a really nice perk. The Slottables we are using here then are Fighting Finesse, Biting Aura, Thaumaturge, and Backstabber. And whenever Backstabber isn't worth using, you can try using Deadly Aim or one of the Slottables that give weapon damage. Okay, cool. So that's more or less it from me on the Stamina Templar. Thanks for taking the time to watch. If you found it useful, please do like and subscribe, and check the description below for similar videos for other classes. This is Liko, stay healthy and have a nice day.